For years, the UAE has projected itself as a model of stability in the Middle East, closely aligned with Gulf partners and embedded within established frameworks. But that image is increasingly being questioned in the last few years, from its decision to walk away from the OPEC without coordination, to rising tensions with other countries in the region like Saudi Arabia, and its expanding footprint across multiple conflict zones where people die in droves. There are clear signs of a major shift in how Abu Dhabi is operating in the last decade. Its use of non-state actors in multiple countries, its growing diplomatic and security partnership with a genocidal state like Israel, and mounting accusations around its role in massacres in the region are raising deeper concerns about the direction it's taking. Some analysts even go to the extent of accusing it of imitating Israel in its divide and rule policy in the region as a destabilizing actor. In today's episode of Clashpoint, we will examine how the UAE is defining its role in the region, what is driving this major shift, and what consequences it may have for the balance of power across the Middle East. Joining me today is Dr. Andreas Krieg, a senior lecturer in security studies at King's College London and a fellow at the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies. Dr. Andreas specializes in Middle East geopolitics, proxy warfare, and the use of non-state actors in modern conflict. His work has focused extensively on Gulf security dynamics, including UAE's regional strategy, its use of influence network, and its role across multiple conflict zones such as Yemen, Libya, and the Horn of Africa. Beyond academia, he regularly advises governments and international organizations on defense and security issues, and frequently contributes to major international media outlets providing analysis on evolving power dynamics in the Middle East. Dr. Andreas Krieg, thank you for coming to the interview, and welcome to Clashpoint.
Thanks for having me.
So the UAE walked out of the OPEC without consulting Saudi Arabia or any of the other actors and countries in the organization. Some analysts have claimed that the split was signaled for many years. OPEC exit was just the beginning, and or even the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and even the GCC are now under review. They have had a lot of tensions with Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region. It has been accused of dangerous behavior in the region. So what are we witnessing right now? Because this is something that we have not seen for decades. The OPEC has always been there, and the UAE has been part of that organization for a very long time. So what are we witnessing, and is this breakaway from the Arab order?
Not yet, but I think we're in a process where Abu Dhabi is trying to redefine its destiny moving forward. It's been in an immense crisis, it's the most severe crisis in its very young history. And it seems that a lot of the assumptions that Abu Dhabi has made over the last couple of decades over security were undermined, some of them, particularly in terms of reliance on partners, neighbors, and even the United States and great powers. So it's a time of reckoning where the UAE are really trying to regain some control over its destiny. And part of that is redefining its multilateral entanglement in the world, and particularly in the region. And what they're now publicly saying is that everything is under review, every relationship is under review, and they're really looking at the utility of these memberships in these organizations to their own security. And we also have to understand Abu Dhabi is a very Machiavellian country. It's a country that purely builds itself around national interest. It's about making sure that it serves Abu Dhabi's interest. And that's very important. It's not just UAE interest, it's Abu Dhabi interest. And from an interest point of view, you could make an argument that membership in some of these multilateral organizations might not be beneficial in the short run. They might be very beneficial in the long run, but it's a very short-term focused approach that they're taking at the moment. OPEC obviously has, as you already said, I mean, since 2020, since COVID, there's been immense tension between Abu Dhabi and OPEC, Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia over quotas of exporting oil. And it's not necessarily in Abu Dhabi's interest to constrain itself and comply with quotas. And they haven't actually complied with the quotas for a long time. So this move has been coming, and it's been, many analysts have predicted this happening. And so it's not a surprise. It's not necessarily a problem for OPEC, and I think it's mostly an energy political issue. I think it's the underlying bit about geopolitically redefining their destiny vis-a-vis their partners that could lead them potentially reconsidering their ties with the Arab League, which is quite likely, reconsidering their ties with the Organization of Islamic States. I think the GCC is off limits for now. It wouldn't make any sense to really sever ties, direct neighbors with whom you share not just borders, but a history, language, tribes, families. religion, you name it. They are quite a united block of similar, sociopolitically quite similar people. So it wouldn't make any sense for them to sever ties there. But they could downgrade their commitment to the GCC. And we've seen that already happening time and again. The issue being Saudi Arabia was the big brother that used to lead this organization. And so for the Emiratis, this is always been about, defining their position vis-a-vis Saudi. And it could well be that they're saying, if there's a summit, we will send the second or third guard. We will not commit to, joined communiques. And we've seen that already happening over the last couple of weeks, where the Emiratis have not embraced joint communiques of the Arab League or the GCC and so on and so forth. But it's not a break from the Arab world yet. But there is a way of they try to redefine who they are within a changing world order, basically.
You said Emirati, not only Emirati benefit, but specifically Abu Dhabi benefit. What did you mean by that?
It's a country officially of seven. It's a federation of 7 emirates, which were at least initially believed to be somewhat equal. It's been quite clear Abu Dhabi is the biggest emirate in terms of size, in terms of GDP. What we've seen in the era of Mohammed bin Zayed is that we've seen an increasingly Abu Dhabi-centric UAE. And they drive every element of statecraft, of foreign policy, security policies determined by the Al Nahyan, by the royal family of Abu Dhabi, while everyone else has to somewhat fall in line. And Abu Dhabi takes a very different approach to regional security. They're far more Machiavellian, they're far more linear in their thinking at times. They're far more deterministic, far more doubling down, far more zero-sum than, for example, the Maktoums or the Al-Qasimi and other royal families in the Emirates. And I think the reason for that is that, it goes back to the history of where the Al Nahyan, where the Baniyas are coming from as well, which are in their thinking more Bedouin, less commercially minded, less open to the world, coming from the inland of Arabia rather than from the coast. And a lot of that strategic culture that we see is Abu Dhabi strategic culture, which now people conflate with the UAE strategic culture. And so there is internal friction. This friction that we're describing between Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi is also a friction between Abu Dhabi and the small Emirates. And I think this war and the position that Abu Dhabi's now taken publicly about deterrence, belligerents, fighting back against Iran rather than trying to engage in negotiation, instead of finding a common, mutually beneficial, multilateral solution to this problem of Iran, they're saying we have to do it our own way, and we'll do it if necessary with the Israelis, and we'll have to do it if necessary by force, which is not necessarily in the interest of Dubai, for example, in terms of that mercantile, commercial, strategic culture that Dubai has displayed over decades. And so there is friction internally as well, but Abu Dhabi dictates the terms ultimately.
You've argued before that Abu Dhabi built what you called an axis of secessionists, using non-state actors in Libya, Yemen, Sudan, in Somalia as Trojan horses to generate strategic depth and influence. If we start with that doctrine, what is the ideological core driving this project? What does the UAE hope to achieve by playing such roles, especially destabilizing the surrounding countries? Like, why are they doing this, and what's their basic motivation?
No, Abu Dhabi has a very different ontology, philosophy over how they define stability and security to other states in the region. First and foremost, its stability is the referent object for security for them is always a regime. It's about regime survival, regime security, and stability. It means control over people, it means control over civil society, and it's control over the destiny of any activity that's going on within their jurisdiction. It's a very hierarchical, very top-down sort of socio-political setup, which is slightly different from Saudi Arabia, certainly very different from Oman, different from Qatar and other countries in the region. I don't think it's about ideology per se. There is an ideological element. We can talk about this later, but I think it is about interests. Here is a country, and I should say the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, that in size is still very, very small compared to the GDP that they generate in comparison to the money that they've accumulated, the sovereign capital that they have. But what they're lacking is capacity, human capacity and strategic depth in terms of territory. And so what they had to come up with, which is natural, and by the way, this is not unique to Abu Dhabi, but Abu Dhabi has brought it to another level. It's the idea that you need to delegate to outsiders, that you have to build your own networks because you don't have human capacity in house. It's a country where you have a 90-10 sort of divide from locals to so from expats to locals. Only 10% of the population are actually locals. So you can't build a military with that. You can't staff a civil service with that. So if you wanted to have the sort of statecraft depth that that the UAE, that Abu Dhabi in particular, is aspiring to have as what they call themselves now a middle power, you have to delegate. You have to buy mercenaries. You have to buy people in from outside who can do it for you. And so the approach that they've taken, I find, is quite similar to where England has been in the 1600s. Is the idea of building commercial networks, using interlocutors, using locals to kind of project power and influence across the world. The only difference here is that it's not just a commercial project. It started as a commercial project, but ultimately it's about strategic depth, projecting influence across the region, making itself indispensable in a lot of the important crises, conflicts, and negotiations. I shouldn't say negotiations more in the debates in the region. And in order to do this, they had to plug in to local networks, and they had to use locals to work through them. They had to use interlocutors to get to where they want to go because they don't have in-house capacity. And so this network project, which starts in Libya in 2014, the idea that, you know, you can build your own non-state militia, non-state actor like the Libyan National Army, as they call themselves, around a military strongman like Haftar. That was a model that worked for the UAE because it required a lot of money, and money is something Abu Dhabi has in abundance, but it doesn't require in-house capacity. They were able to delegate it to local militias. And that model has worked for them. It has worked for them in Yemen with the STC, which is now largely fallen apart, but the network still exists on the ground. It works for them in Somaliland. It works for them in Sudan with the RSF. And you have here a small state, by all accounts and metrics, it's small, with the ambition of a middle power that was able to generate power, generate influence through networks by mobilizing these networks, orchestrating them. And these networks are multi-layered. These networks are not just your militias, your armed, violent, non-state actors like the LNA, like the RSF, or the wings of the military wings of the SEC. What you have is a multi-layered network where these militias are just the tip of the iceberg. The underbelly of this tip of the iceberg are commodity traders, are logisticians, are financiers, are bankers, are information networks, people who PR companies, but also trolls and bots who are in these countries pushing Emirati narratives. So it's a very comprehensive, very sophisticated, in many ways, sophisticated network that they've built that is also quite resilient in a way that these networks can't just be broken up very easily because they are so multi-layered. And if you take a node out of the network is not collapsing. In many ways, actually, if you compare this, it's quite similar to what we've seen with Iran and Iranian resilience, which is built around these sort of networks, the axis of resistance, as they call it, as well. Hence why I call this, the Emirati project, the axis of secessionists, because it's an axis. It's quite similar. There is training going on. There's arms, there's commodities, there's capital flowing through this network to make it a almost self-sustaining entity or system. And Abu Dhabi being at the core of that system, and they're using it to kind of project force and make themselves indispensable.
I mean, there are surely other models of surviving for a small country. They don't have to be this Machiavellian and disturb the peace and destabilize. There are other smaller countries, relatively very successful economies in the world today, which are not known for destabilizing their neighbors. And that would have, I think, worked. Some analysts claim the UAE is an Israel wannabe, and it wants to play the roles that have been played by Israel, preferably in the American context. Would that be something that you would agree to, or do you see any accuracy?
I think the Emirati model vis-a-vis Washington is one that's trying to emulate the Israel lobby. I think the greatest source of power for Israel, outside of probably its tech sector, is the lobby that they have built, the networks they've built in Washington to have an impact and shape decision-making and U.S. statecraft vis-a-vis the Middle East. That is something, probably the greatest source of power for Israel. And it's something that the Emiratis have studied. The Emiratis were in a very different boat in 2006, and I think that's an important thing to remember. The thing that to remember is in 2006, DP World, one of the biggest port terminal operators, wanted to take over, I think, one or two eastern seaboard ports in the United States and were stopped from doing so because there was a lot of backlash domestically after 9/11 to say this is a Muslim country that is not supposed to run critical national infrastructure. It was a turning point. It showed the Emiratis that they were being perceived as just another Muslim or just another Middle Eastern country. They didn't want that. They wanted to emerge from this as a sort of exceptional Middle Eastern country. And this is the starting point for this Emirati idea of Emirati exceptionalism, the idea that they are different from the other Arab, other Muslim countries, other Middle Eastern countries. 2006 is a turning point in the way for where the Emiratis are trying to look at the Israeli model of building networks in Washington and started building their own networks to push their own narratives, to use mostly financial depth that they have in order to sway people, but also using human to human networks. And gradually we see the Emiratis building that up from the mid 2000s to the mid 2010s. And we're seeing that at the height of the Arab Spring, probably 2013-14, we see the Emirati networks really kicking into gear in Washington, where they're able to promote and push particular narratives. So Israel has been very well studied as a model for a small state, because Israel is a small state, and how, as a small state, they could have this disproportionate sway over statecraft in the United States. And in many ways, the Emiratis emulated that. And over time, not only have they studied Israel, but in many ways they have also become a lot closer to Israel, which then obviously led to the Abraham Accords ultimately, where we see the approach and the strategic narrative, the ontologies that are being used in Abu Dhabi to justify their statecraft, which is built around fighting political Islam or fighting Islam, fighting Islamic civil society, authoritarianism, promoting authoritarianism in the region, saying that the Arab Street is a very, very dangerous space. The Arab Spring was seen as the Arab winter in the same way that this was the case for Israel. So during the Arab Spring, we see this also ideological alignment emerging between Israel and the UAE, who see the same threats, who would like to see an authoritarian stability in the region, where authoritarian countries are dictating the terms of stability in the region, which is very different to, let's say, how Turkey, Qatar, but a lot of other Middle Eastern countries as well look at stability. And that's the Israeli model. And that ideological alignment, which was also pushed through the axis of resistance, where they're building non-state actors to suppress civil society under the cloak of fighting terrorism and fighting political Islam, they've been clamping down, obviously the best example being the RSF, on local movements and local people. And that is something that I think we've seen culminating in the Abraham Accords.
Let's talk about the Abraham Accords, which was sold as a peace project, which also denotes an alliance with a country like Israel, which is now committing a genocide. It has a case in the ICJ. Their trade is soaring rapidly between the UAE and Israel. They've had a joint intelligence platform called Crystal Ball. Leaked US documents actually revealed the UAE was sharing intelligence with Israel through a framework called the Regional Security Construct. So in such context, at what point does participation become complicity? I mean, can a peace project like the Abraham Accords, a peace project that they call it, despite an ongoing genocide, can it succeed? And is the UAE, through its intelligence fusion with Israel, making itself a structural partner in the genocide Israel is committing in the region?
It's quite clear that for Abu Dhabi, the Palestinian cause never really mattered, particularly for Mohammed bin Zayed, I should say. Obviously, Sheikh Zayed, different era, different time. But for Mohammed bin Zayed and his era in Abu Dhabi, the Palestinian cause was a fringe issue, something that didn't really concern national interests in Abu Dhabi. Now, I'd say it still doesn't concern national interests in Abu Dhabi today. There have been a lot of leaks through, WikiLeaks at the time, where a lot of the cables that were sent, diplomatic cables, which suggested that, MBZ was talking very in a very negative way about the Palestinian cause. So it was never, the Abraham Accords was never about peace, and it was never about, the Palestinian case. It was about national interest. It's what Abu Dhabi can gain from having access and normalized relations with Israel, having access to their tech sector, having access to their intelligence networks across the regions, as well as intelligence technology, providing Israel with access to Emirati jurisdictions and Emirati territories, not just in the UAE, but also these territories that the UAE controls via proxy, like in Yemen and Somaliland, and even in Sudan. So it was an interest-based alliance, and it still is an interest-based alliance. It's not ideological. This only ideological component is this common fight against Islamism or terrorism, as they call it. But it's really a fight against the Arab street, and it's a fight against those who are promoting the Palestinian cause ultimately. And so what happened in Gaza is, again, the Emiratis being extremely pragmatic in the way that they're saying, how can we present ourselves to Washington as an exceptional Arab country? And Washington always being traditionally close to Israel, where there is this sort of compulsive framework that's been built in Washington, where for a long time people just didn't allow themselves to criticize Israel, and they kind of fell in line after the 7th of October. So in this climate, the Emiratis were saying, look, we're the only Arab country that can actually help you out proactively because we have a relationship with the Israelis. None of the other Arab countries have that. And they were willing to offer whatever was needed. So obviously they provided a lot of humanitarian aid for Gazans, but at the same time, they enabled the IDF through, back channel deals where they've provided some of the mercenaries on the ground. They were offering to police together with the IDF the Gaza Strip. They were really presenting themselves to the Trump administration and the Biden administration as an enabler of saying, whatever you need Israel doing, if you need troops, we can provide you with that. If you want us to help with humanitarian aid distribution, we can help you with that. And we're doing this in conjunction with the Israelis. So this whole relationship wasn't about the fate of the Palestinians per se. It is about saying we are different. We are an exceptional Arab Muslim country. In many ways, Abu Dhabi has been really shunned away from calling itself a Muslim country. I think they want to stay away from it because they don't want to be thrown into the same mix with other Muslim countries. They have a very uneasy relationship with Islam, and that's been going on again for 15 years. But Gaza was, in many ways, I wouldn't say they were complicit in what Israel was doing. They were certainly not using the leverage that they had over Israel to stop Israel doing what it's doing. And I think that is in itself quite problematic.
Let's come to the issue of self-presentation. As you know, Abu Dhabi positions itself as a hub of modernity, tolerance, and stability. Some people even call it the Switzerland of the Middle East. Yet its actions paint a very grim picture. It arms genocidal militias, it backs secessionist warlords, it runs covert influence operations across continents, and it works closely with Israel, which is undeniably a country that is involved in a genocide of its own. It's now walking out of the regional ties that it has in some way or another. So in such context, can one say the UAE is approaching its tipping point, being behind the instability of many of the countries surrounding it? How is the Saudi bloc going to act once ties are formally severed, where they would not have to compromise for anything, because when ties are formally severed, states act more aggressively? So can we say that the UAE is actually approaching its tipping point in the region?
First of all, I don't think that relations will be severed between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The UAE will downgrade some of the relationships in multilateral organizations. But we also need to bear in mind that since the blockade of Qatar in 2017, we've seen a lot of what happens in the Gulf through bilateral channels. So multilateralism hasn't died this week. It has died a long time ago. I don't think they're going to sever ties. I also disagree to say that the UAE was ever seen as the Switzerland of the Middle East, because that's never their ambition to be that. I think that's probably the term used for Qatar to describe Qatar or Oman as mediators. UAE has never been a mediator. The UAE has been very assertive, and if you're Machiavellian and you're purely interest driven, you're not the right person to do mediation. And that's also not their ambition. I think they never wanted to be that. But going back to 2006, where the UAE really tried hard to change their image of saying we're different. We're not affiliated with Islamism or Al Qaeda and so on in the post 9/11 era. I think the UAE wanted to be seen as a palatable partner in the Middle East. And I think we've seen now a tipping point where for many, many years, the UAE was seen in Washington and in a lot of Western capitals as that sort of country, as a country that was different, which was open for commerce, which was modern, so to speak, had a different relationship with Islam, which I think for many Western audiences was appealing, of saying, the Emiratis had that narrative of dividing religion from the state as being a purely non-religious state and a purely Jeffersonian state in many ways. That was appealing. PR-wise, the developments of the last couple of years, and especially since the 7th of October, PR-wise, I think the UAE has been on a downhill slope. I think PR-wise, they're no longer dominating the scene as they have done 10 years ago. Reason being is that the partners or the neighbors, Qatar and Saudi Arabia in particular, have become very dominant in the information domain themselves in Washington and other European capitals. So the Emiratis are no longer on their own. The axis of secessionists was or has been a problem because the UAE is no longer seen as actually advancing stability as they were propagating 10 years ago. They seem to be now a cause of instability in the region by arming non-state actors and secessionists, particularly arming them and undermining the integrity of states. And that is certainly something that a lot of Western countries see as problematic. Western countries would like to see united countries based on territorial integrity. Having secessionists running certain pockets within countries and then thereby destabilizing central government is not in the interest of many Western countries. And I think the tipping point here is particularly Sudan because of the atrocities that were committed. So we knew what the LNA was up to in Libya, and it was problematic. We've seen what the SDC and some of these groups were up to in Yemen, but Yemen was seen as a civil war, so the Emiratis were backing one side in it. Sudan is different because the RSF is different. The RSF is a genocidal militia. They have been involved in some of the worst atrocities that we've seen in the last couple of years, and I'm saying it at a time when we've seen a genocidal war being unraveled in Gaza. Despite these atrocities, some of the atrocities we've seen in Sudan might even be worse than what happened in Gaza. And it was fueled, supported, enabled by the UAE. And the UAE have not backed down, despite all the, half a year ago and late 2025, a lot of media coverage of what's going on in Sudan, a lot of negative publicity. And you'd think the UAE would respond to that by saying, we're backing out, we are, U-turning. But again, that goes against the Emirati strategic culture, going back to this sort of Bedouin mindset of doubling down rather than backing out. The idea that, when they're confronted with a crisis and they're confronted with pressure, they're pushed through that pressure rather than backing down and apologizing. And that makes them fundamentally different from other royal families in the region, makes them even different from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has had, on multiple occasions, some sort of learning curve. They've seemed adaptive. When they come under pressure and criticism, they do change. Qatar had come under criticism and has changed. The UAE has come under criticism time and again and haven't changed. And that doubling down seems to suggest they're digging a deeper and deeper hole. It's a little bit like Israel in many ways, where the Kool-Aid, the Abu Dhabi Kool-Aid that everybody has drunken it in the UAE has gone so deep that there is an echo chamber where everyone is saying, no, the others are wrong, despite the fact that the vast majority of Arabs, Muslims, increasingly a lot of Western governments have turned against the UAE's policy and statecraft in the region. And the UAE seems to suggest we don't need them anymore. And that's kind of the last couple of days. We've seen a lot of narrative coming out of Abu Dhabi, in particular, saying, we're different. We can be on our own. We don't need anyone. We are autonomous. We're sovereign. We are autarkic in many ways. We don't need great powers to support us. We don't really need the GCC. We don't need our neighbors. We do our own thing, which all sounds great, but in practice obviously doesn't work. And that mentality of us against the rest of the world is very similar to what we're seeing in Israel, in Netanyahu's Israel now, where, Israel is completely sidelined globally, completely isolated. And instead of changing course, Netanyahu says, we're doubling down on this because it's us against the rest of the world. And so that is something we're seeing in Abu Dhabi. It's a turning point for Abu Dhabi's perception in the region, but I generally don't think they care.
You've mentioned Sudan. Sudan has filed a genocide case against the UAE, accusing Abu Dhabi of financing, arming, and providing diplomatic cover for the RSF, a genocidal militia accused of mass killings and systematic rape. You've argued before that the UAE is working to shield itself from accountability in that regard and deploying its PR companies to give RSF a veneer of legitimacy, in your words. So, considering its tension with countries in the region and the damage that it has sustained as a destabilizer of the region, can the UAE succeed in doing that? Reports by rights groups have been very sharp in terms of the RSF in documenting some of the atrocities that they've done. So would its allies in DC and probably Europe risk it for the UAE just like they risk it for Israel, for example? Would they tolerate such cases?
I don't think anybody's tolerating Israel's behavior. It's taken the West quite long to come to open what we call the Overton window. The Overton window describes the bandwidth of what can and cannot be said. And that window was very, very tight after the 7th of October, where criticism of Israel was almost not allowed. The atrocities that Israel has committed and keeps on committing has widened that Overton window to a degree where now open criticism of Israel among all parties, even supporters of Israel, prior supporters of Israel, is possible. That Overton window has been opened for the Emiratis as well. Everything is possible. They're not being shielded. I think, unlike Israel, though, the model that the Emiratis are pushing through this axis of secessionists, through networks, is far more complex and sophisticated than many people realize, because you're creating multi-layered networks that do your bidding. A lot of the interlocutors who channel weapons and money and funnel them back into Sudan and the RSF, these networks are run by non-Emiratis. They might use companies in the Emirates, and they might get support in the Emirates from Emirati officials, but ultimately these are often locals, Sudanese, who are based in the UAE, using the UAE jurisdiction to do their dirty laundry. It provides Abu Dhabi with a degree of plausible deniability. I would call it even implausible deniability, because you can no longer really deny it. I think it's out there. But in legal matters, if you can bring a case, sustain a case, and win a case in front of an international court, that is going to be very, very difficult. Attribution of these atrocities to the UAE is so indirect, because it involves so many different layers, that I think Abu Dhabi will probably get away with it, at least legally speaking, unless the United States will have the guts, the strength and the bravery to actually confront the Emiratis and confront Abu Dhabi and say it has to stop. And that hasn't happened yet. And the European partners, especially UK, have voiced their criticism. But as long as the United States are not saying this has to stop, Abu Dhabi will not stop. And Abu Dhabi is selling this to the United States, is selling Sudan, is selling the RSF to the United States. We're saying we're fighting terrorism, we're fighting the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Trump administration has clearly shown they're not very sophisticated in their knowledge of the Middle East and their knowledge of local affairs, that they might just swallow this narrative for now. And I think that will change behavior. It might change behavior in Abu Dhabi. Legal cases, I don't think will.
You've said before that the UAE is still worried about being seen as a rogue state in the public sphere. How will it survive being openly known as an ally of Israel, even in terms of security and intelligence, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world? Can it ever salvage a different imagery in the Muslim world anytime soon? I mean, most of the population, as you've said, is actually not from the UAE. It's not the locals. 90% of the population is expats, most of them from Muslim countries. It approaches countries, tells them to crack down on their any type of Muslim activities, and it's increasingly seen as an anti-Islamic government in the region. So will it ever be able to salvage its image in terms of popular perception?
Not as long as the current leadership is in place. The Bani Fatima, Mansour Mohammed, Tahnoun, also now MBZ's son, Khalid. This inner core, they want to continue on their path, and they're quite determined to do so. And as I said, they've shown no sign of turning away, pivoting away, adjusting. They're continuing, they're doubling down. I don't think they care much about what the Islamic world thinks. They don't really care what the Arab world thinks, because aspirationally speaking for the Emiratis, what matters to them is how they're being perceived in the West. It's a bit of a imposter syndrome in many ways. It's the idea that you're trying to appeal to Westerners. You want to be seen more Western than the Westerners. You want to be seen as less Muslim than non-Muslims. And it's that idea of having to shed, and it's a shame that they see themselves in that way, but they feel that they need to appeal to a particular audience in the West. That's about appearing less Muslim, less religious, more bureaucratic, less ideological, more technocratic, I think is the better word. And so they do everything for that. They don't really care about, as I said, they want to be different from the rest of the Arabs and the rest of the Muslims. They don't want to be seen as just another Arab or Muslim state. So I don't think they necessarily care about it. Hence why I think they will continue doing what they're doing. I also think, and this is quite clear now, that they're going to double down on that relationship with Israel. Israel has provided the UAE with 3 Iron Domes, include batteries that were stationed in Abu Dhabi, including with IDF soldiers manning it. And that has set a precedent. It's a precedent that you have Israeli soldiers stationed in the UAE. That means we will see more of that happening rather than less. We will see also, I think, in Somaliland, greater cooperation between the UAE and Israel. So we have an alliance that's been built that exists next to the alliance of, let's say, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, Pakistan, which is an alliance between the UAE and Israel, and potentially UAE and America. But I think it's more UAE and Israel. They will do it because they think it serves their interests, until it doesn't. And having that axis of secessionists and giving and providing the capabilities of the axis of secessionists to the Israelis is something the Emirates would want to do. So we're seeing a tighter, more deeper integration. The only issue is that obviously Arab Muslim world will fight back. I think the neighbors will push back, but what it will end up doing is creating disruption among very closely related neighbors, right, who are quite alike. And it will make a common Gulf position harder to achieve. And it's exactly, I think, what Israel wants to do. Israel has a long history of divide and rule, of dividing the Arab world in order to make it more malleable. And I think the Gulf has appeared over the last couple of years as a fairly united front in Washington, at least, and that has threatened the Israel lobby. And I think for the Israelis, it's very, very beneficial to divide the Gulf. And the UAE are playing a part in this because they think they're driven by short-term interest. And I think that is kind of the danger that the Saudis are seeing, and where the Saudis are now saying enough is enough, we have to push back.
Yeah, so that seems to be the problem. So the strategy that you get to destabilize all your neighbors, you get to attack them. For example, take Israel, now fighting a 7-front war. It's attacking everyone, and somehow this works for your stability is really outrageous. Stability works when your neighbors are also living in stability, and the UAE following that lead is surely going to cause a lot of mayhem in the region, and I hope somehow this might stop. Dr. Andreas, thank you for coming to the interview and sharing your ideas with our viewers. I'm duly indebted, and thank you very much.
Pleasure.
When you look across the region, what becomes visible is not just a series of isolated decisions by a single country, but a broader pattern of behavior that is reshaping dynamics on multiple fronts. The UAE's pursuit of influence, its willingness to operate in Machiavellian methods, and its growing network of partnerships have given it reach far beyond its size, but they have also intensified tensions and scrutiny. At the same time, questions around accountability, regional backlash, and long-term sustainability are becoming harder to ignore. Will this trajectory continue without consequence, or are we approaching a moment where the cost is beginning to outweigh the gains for the UAE? I hope you have enjoyed our session today. You've been listening to Clashpoint, and I am Isaac Eshetu. If this conversation helped you better understand the issue at hand, make sure to like and share this episode. Leave your thoughts in the comments so we know what you think, and follow us on our social media, and stay tuned to Clashpoint for more geopolitical analysis. Until next time, stay informed.